No one expected that in the lonely sweep of the Tularosa Basin, a grieving mother would find herself reflected in the trembling eyes of an orphaned elephant calf. A drone video revealed the moment it was left behind in the ashes. A lullaby stopped its cries. A raging dust storm forced a choice between safety and love. Then one morning, the calf vanished, until it returned with its herd and left a final gift in the sand that stunned everyone. The first light over the Tularosa Basin slipped in quietly, turning the sand outside Evelyn Carter's kitchen window into a pale silver sheet. She stood at the counter in her worn robe, watching the desert wake up, one hand around a coffee mug, the other resting on the back of an empty chair that still pulled at her chest every morning. Jake's chair. She hadn't moved it an inch. The house was too tidy now, too still. No gear piled by the door, no boots tracking dust across the tile, no hurried goodbyes as her son rushed out to another fire line. The only sounds were the low hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood, like the bones of the place were protesting the silence. It felt less like a home and more like a museum of her former life. On the table near the window, his wildfire helmet sat beside a folded American flag in a neat triangular frame. Evelyn's fingers brushed the brim as she passed, tracing the scuffs along the edge. She used to patch up soldiers in combat hospitals overseas, but nothing in those years of trauma medicine had prepared her. For the moment, 2 uniformed officers showed up at her door and asked if they could come in. She still remembered the smell of smoke clinging to his jacket the last time he hugged her goodbye. Jake had laughed off her worry, told her he'd seen worse fires than this one, and promised to be back for Sunday dinner. Now his jacket hung on a hook by the door, untouched, like it was waiting for shoulders that would never fill it again. Evelyn walked past it carefully, as if brushing against the fabric might make the truth collapse on her. Outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the faint mingled scents of dust, creosote, and distant engine fumes from the highway. Beyond the low wire fence, the land stretched out in muted browns and pale golds, rising into white gypsum dunes further off, a bright scar in the desert. Somewhere past that, the wildlife refuge began, a patchwork of scrub, mesquite, and the tall fencing that tried to keep wild things out of human trouble. She stepped onto the porch, the old boards sighing under her slippers. For a moment she just stood there, letting the cold bite against the thin fabric of her robe. Her neighbors were still asleep. The Hernandez family's trailer sat quiet down the dirt road, their porch light flickering, stubbornly clinging to the last scraps of night. A hawk circled high overhead, lazy and unbothered, as if the world hadn't ripped itself apart in her living room months. Ego. Evelyn sank into the weathered lawn chair Jake used to fix whenever it started to wobble. Her coffee had gone lukewarm, but she took a sip anyway, more out of habit than desire. The VA counselor had told her routines would help. Wake up, get dressed, eat, walk, repeat. But routines didn't know how to deal with the way grief came in waves, sometimes as gentle ache, sometimes as a punch that took the air right out of her lungs. From inside, the radio she'd left on low muttered through static, a local station rambling about weather alerts and controlled burns up in the mountains. Words like fire line, containment, and hotspots drifted through the screen door and lodged in her chest like shrapnel. She reached back and turned the volume down with shaking fingers, leaving the desert to its own kind of quiet. Her gaze drifted along the fence line, following the dusty track Jake's truck used to make. Then beyond, to where the refuge's perimeter fence cut across the land like a dull gray scar. Sometimes, in the cool hours before noon, she could see silhouettes moving out there. Deer, pronghorn, the occasional coyote trotting with tilted confidence. But this morning, nothing stirred. The horizon looked empty enough to swallow her whole. Evelyn told herself she should go back inside, start a load of laundry, call the insurance company like she'd been meaning to. Instead, she stayed where she was, fingers tightening around the mug as the rising sun threw long shadows across the yard. There was a strange weight to the air, a sense that the day was holding its breath, waiting for something to step over an unseen line. She tried to shake it off, blaming it on another bad night of sleep. The sound came so softly at first, she thought she'd imagined it. A low, drawn-out rumble that vibrated more in her chest than in her ears. It wasn't a truck, not thunder either. It rose and fell unevenly, like someone trying not to sob, the sound catching and breaking on the way out. Evelyn straightened slowly, every instinct she'd honed in war zones prickling awake under her skin. She set her mug down and stepped off the porch, gravel crunching under her slippers as she walked toward the fence. The closer she came, the clearer the sound grew. A strange, mournful note, deeper than a human voice, trembling at the edges. She paused at the gate, fingers resting on the metal latch, suddenly aware of how small she was against the vast, open land. The rumble came again, frayed with something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Evelyn slid the latch free and stepped through, the early sun stabbing at her eyes as she scanned the scrub beyond her property line. At first she saw nothing but mesquite, low brush, and the faint shimmer of heat already rising from the sand. Then, near a sagging section of the outer refuge fence, something gray shifted against the pale earth. Her breath caught in her throat. It was no deer, no coyote. It was bigger, heavier. The shape hunched and wrong, like it had folded in on itself to stay upright. As her eyes adjusted, the shape resolved into wrinkled skin, dust-caked ears, and a small, trembling trunk dragging patterns in the sand. The animal couldn't have been more than a couple of years old, its body far too thin for its size. Ash streaks clung stubbornly to its back and sides, like it had walked straight out of the memory of a fire that refused to let go. It stood alone by the fence, legs braced, making no move to run, as if it had finally run out of places to go. The calf lifted its head slowly, as if the movement cost it something. Its eyes met hers across the distance, dark, shining, impossibly tired for something so young. In those eyes, Evelyn saw, with a force that hit her like a physical blow, the same hollow, stunned look she had seen on soldiers after explosions, on parents clutching empty blankets in hospital corridors, in her own reflection above a sink stained with dried tears. The desert around them seemed to fall away, leaving nothing but the space between a woman who had lost her child and a child who had lost its world. The wind had softened by late morning, leaving the desert strangely hushed as Evelyn stood beside the sagging refuge fence. The little elephant hadn't moved much, only shifted its weight like each breath demanded more strength than it could spare. Ash clung to its skin in dull streaks, as if the fire still lived on its back. Footprints circled the area, small, scattered, confused. Evelyn crouched carefully, her knees aching as she studied the shallow impressions in the sand. They told a story she didn't want to imagine. A young calf pacing in tight loops, searching for something it expected to find. Something that should have been there. A mother's shadow. Behind her, a pickup rattled down the dirt road, sending dust spiraling. Mason Brooks climbed out, vet bag slung over his shoulder, followed by Carla Ortiz, her badge catching the sun. Their boots hit the earth with practiced certainty, but both slowed when they saw the calf, as if the weight of the scene pressed against them. Leo arrived seconds later on his bike, panting hard, helmet askew. He held his drone controller against his chest like it might break apart if he loosened his grip. You need to see this," he told Mason, voice trembling. His eyes flickered toward the calf, then back to Evelyn with a look too old for his 14 years. Mason played the drone footage on his tablet. The images flickered under the bright sun, A fleeing herd, dust clouds rising, the echo of gunshots drifting across scorched earth. Then the frame caught the calf stumbling, calling out, slowing, and finally stopping beside a burned patch of ground where smoke still curled upward. No adult elephants remained in sight. Evelyn felt her stomach twist. She recognized the burned terrain. She'd seen it on the news during the wildfire that took Jake. The thought pushed through her chest like a splinter. Fire didn't care who or what it separated. It simply consumed, and everything else tried to survive the aftermath in whatever way it could. Carla knelt a few feet from the calf, lowering her voice into something steady but gentle. She's dehydrated, scared out of her mind, alone for too long. The calf tried to rumble, but the sound broke apart, thin and high. Carla's jaw tightened. If her mother's alive, she wouldn't be here like this. Mason examined the calf's legs, tracing old patches of singed skin and fresh cuts from running through brush. His voice was quiet when he spoke. This little one lost her herd. And without guidance, she won't survive long. Not out here. He didn't say the other part out loud. Everyone could hear it in the silence. The calf reached her trunk toward Evelyn, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the faint warmth of its breath. Something unspoken passed between them, something raw and familiar, recognition born of loss. Evelyn slowly extended her hand, stopping just short of the calf's reach, offering presence instead of contact. Leo stepped closer, his voice small. She kept circling that burned spot in the footage, like she didn't know where to go next. Evelyn swallowed hard. When someone you love disappears into smoke, the world doesn't give you instructions for what comes after. You just keep searching until you can't anymore. A breeze tugged at Evelyn's sleeve, carrying the faint scent of charred brush. She exhaled shakily, fighting the echo of memory. Jake disappearing into orange haze, the long hours waiting by a phone that never rang. The calf took a single step toward her, trembling, as if her grief had created a path the animal recognized. Carla cleared her throat and stood. We need to move her to the holding pen. She'll be safer there, and we have protocols. Evelyn nodded, though the word felt heavy. Protocols couldn't fix what had already been taken. Still, she walked beside the calf as Mason and Carla guided it toward the refuge gate, each slow step stirring dust and something deeper inside her. When they reached the pen, the calf hesitated, glancing back toward Evelyn with wide, dark eyes. The moment stretched, delicate as a held breath. Evelyn gently rested her palm on the gate, wishing she could promise things she didn't understand yet, only that she wouldn't turn away. Not from this calf. Not again. As the sun climbed higher, thin shadows gathered beneath the steel bars, wrapping the calf in strips of broken light. Evelyn lingered outside the pen long after Mason finished his assessment. The desert was quiet once more, but the quiet felt different, less empty, more expectant. As if something had just begun, born not from hope, but from shared ache. The evening settled over the refuge with a soft amber glow, stretching long shadows across the holding pen, where the little elephant rested. Evelyn stood just outside the bars, hands tucked into the sleeves of her jacket, unsure why she'd come back so soon. The calf lifted her head slowly, as if recognizing the shape of the woman who hadn't looked away from her earlier that morning. Mason's notes rustled in the wind as he walked the perimeter, checking the hinges and water trough. He kept his voice low, mostly to himself, but every so often he glanced at Evelyn, studying the way she hovered near the calf. She's not eating much yet, he murmured. Stress shuts them down. Fear does the rest. His words drifted into the dusk, stark and honest. Evelyn stepped a little closer, feeling the cold metal of the pen press lightly against her arm. The calf shifted her weight, trunk curling weakly over the straw. Her breaths came shallow, uneven, like each inhale was a decision she had to make. Evelyn knew that rhythm too well. She'd listened to soldiers breathe like that when hope was barely holding on. Leo arrived on his bike again, skidding to a stop beside the fence, a flashlight dangling from his wrist. He didn't say much, just peered through the bars at the calf with a worried crease in his forehead. "She cried earlier," he whispered. Not loud, just like she didn't know how to stop. Evelyn's chest tightened at the image, a sound she could almost hear without hearing. When Mason left to grab more supplies, and Leo pedaled home at his mother's call, the pen grew quiet except for the steady rustle of dry grass. Twilight deepened around them, turning the desert purple and soft. Evelyn stayed, unsure of what kept her rooted there. The calf lifted her head once more, eyes reflecting the last traces of sunlight. A breeze swept across the yard, cold enough to make Evelyn wrap her arms around herself. She didn't intend to speak, not at first, but the quiet pressed in too tightly, the kind that magnified grief until it had nowhere left to hide. Almost without thinking, she murmured the first verses of a lullaby she hadn't used since Jake was a toddler. The calf froze, trunk suspended mid-air, as if the notes had touched her before the wind did. Evelyn's voice was soft, worn at the edges, carrying the weight of years she couldn't reclaim. The song drifted through the bars, gentle and cracked, a melody that once belonged to bedtime stories and firelit tents and moments she'd give anything to relive. The little elephant answered, not with a cry, but with a low vibration deep in her chest, a rumble so quiet Evelyn felt it before she heard it. It trembled through the ground, ran up her legs, and settled somewhere behind her ribs. The sound was imperfect, shy, as though the calf was trying to match the rise and fall of the tune. Emotion surged through her without warning, a warmth that rose in her throat and burned behind her eyes. She stepped back, startled by its force. Grief didn't usually soften. It stabbed, it shattered. But here, beside this trembling creature, something loosened just enough to breathe again. The calf lowered her head toward the straw, still rumbling faintly, as if asking her not to stop. Carla appeared near the gate, pausing when she heard the faint duet between woman and orphaned calf. Her expression shifted, the professional mask slipping just long enough to reveal a flicker of understanding. Or maybe heartbreak. "She's responding to you," Carla said softly. "I've never seen one this young calm so quickly." Evelyn didn't trust her voice enough to answer. The stars began to pepper the sky, bright pinpoints against the deepening blue. The desert cooled rapidly, the night taking back its territory from the sun. Evelyn finished the lullaby in a trembling whisper, letting the final note fade into the dark like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The calf eased onto her side, exhaustion settling into her limbs. Her eyes fluttered half shut, but her trunk reached out, brushing the straw near Evelyn's boots, not touching. Just close, a gesture shaped more by need than understanding. Evelyn's hand hovered above it, not daring to close the distance. Not yet. For a long moment they stayed there, two beings who had lost more than they knew how to say, sharing a quiet that felt less like emptiness and more like refuge. Evelyn exhaled slowly, letting the desert night wrap around them both. Something had shifted. Fragile but real. She didn't know what it meant yet. But she knew she would come back tomorrow. For a few days, life slipped into a fragile pattern. Evelyn came to the pen every afternoon, sitting on an overturned bucket while the little elephant watched her from the shade. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she just hummed under her breath. The calf ate a little more when she was there, trunk moving with hesitant intent instead of numb routine. One evening, Mason joined her at the fence, arms folded, face lined deeper than usual. "You know imprinting can be a problem," he said gently. "If she thinks people are her herd, it's harder to place her with other elephants later." Evelyn didn't look away from the calf. "What happens if there is no later?" she asked. Mason had no clean answer. The next morning, Carla knocked on Evelyn's door, dust clinging to her uniform. She held a tablet in one hand, official emails glowing on the screen. "We've got a storm coming," Carla said. "Big dust front rolling in from the west. Headquarters wants us to prep for possible relocation. She might have to be moved to the larger facility north." Evelyn stared at the tablet like it was a medical chart with a prognosis she hated. "Moved?" The word came out thinner than she intended. Carla softened her voice. "It might be temporary, but those are the protocols. We can't let her stay in a compromised structure if that storm hits full force." Protocols. The same word that had followed her through war tents and hospital corridors. As the day wore on, the wind picked up, dragging loose sand across the ground in long, whispering streaks. The sky took on a hazy, bruised color at the horizon. At the refuge, Mason double-checked latches and reinforced panels, while the calf paced in tight circles, trunk flicking nervously, ears twitching at every new groan of metal. Evelyn stood by the pen, jacket zipped tight against the gusts. She could feel the air changing, pressure dropping, that subtle shift that told experienced nurses and old soldiers something was about to break. The calf finally stopped pacing when she started humming again, pressing her small forehead lightly against the bars, as if anchoring herself to the sound. "We'll move her at first light if the storm worsens," Mason called from the gate. "Trucks can't navigate the road safely in zero visibility." Carla frowned at the sky. "If it hits sooner, we hunker down and hope everything holds." Evelyn listened, but her focus stayed on the calf, memorizing the shape of her in the fading light. That night, the desert didn't ease into darkness. It snapped. Wind slammed against Evelyn's windows like a living thing, rattling the frames, shoving dust under the door. The power flickered twice, then steadied, dim and uncertain. The radio crackled with storm advisories and road closures, words blending together into a dull roar in her chest. She tried to lie down, but each gust sent a fresh spike of worry through her. Evelyn could picture the pen too clearly, the thin metal panels, the flimsy roof, the calf flinching with every shriek of wind. Finally, she grabbed her flashlight and Jake's old field jacket, the one that still smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and stepped out into the chaos. The storm hit her like a wall. Sand stung her face, turned the beam of her flashlight into a glowing smear. She shielded her mouth with the collar of the jacket, breathing through fabric, counting steady like she had on long marches with stretchers. Shapes loomed and vanished. Fence posts, mesquite, the vague outline of the refuge building fighting to stand its ground. At the main gate, she found Mason and Carla, both half covered in dust, shouting to be heard over the wind. "A panel blew loose," Carla yelled. "She spooked and bolted before we could get a halter on her. We lost sight of her past the east wash. Visibility's garbage." Mason grabbed Evelyn's arm. "You shouldn't be out here. This isn't safe." Evelyn pulled free, eyes stinging, not just from sand. "She's out there alone. You know what happens to lungs in this kind of storm." The medic in her spoke before the grieving mother could. She tightened Jake's jacket around her and stepped past them, angling toward the dark stretch of land beyond the last floodlight. The desert swallowed her almost immediately. She could barely see 3 yards ahead. The wind turned her footprints into vague smudges the second she made them. Panic nipped at the edges of her mind, quick and sharp, threatening to unravel the calm she'd trained into herself decades ago. She forced her breathing steady and did the only thing she knew the calf might recognize. She started to sing. The lullaby floated into the storm in frayed tatters, snatched and dragged by the wind, but she kept going, verse after verse, voice shaking but determined. "Come on, sweetheart," she muttered between lines, to herself as much as to the calf. "If you can hear me, follow the song." Her eyes burned, and not solely from the sand. Somewhere ahead, buried in the howl, a different sound answered. A thin, broken trumpet, laced with a desperate low rumble. Evelyn turned toward it, stumbling down a shallow slope, boots sliding on loose grit. The beam of her flashlight caught a small, crumpled shape near a dry wash, sides heaving, trunk pressed miserably against the ground. She dropped to her knees beside the calf, the impact jolting up through her spine. Up close, the little elephant's eyes were wet and wild, whole body shaking from more than the cold. Evelyn lowered her voice, letting the song soften to a hum as she laid a hand gently on the calf's dusty forehead. Warmth radiated beneath her palm, frantic and alive. "It's okay," she whispered, though nothing about the night felt okay. "I've got you. I've got you." The calf's breathing hitched, then settled a fraction, trunk lifting weakly to brush against the sleeve of Jake's jacket. For the first time, the contact wasn't through bars or distance. It was skin, fabric, breath, fear, and fragile trust pressed together under a furious sky. They stayed like that as the storm raged, huddled in a shallow dip that gave just enough shelter to keep them upright. Evelyn kept humming, kept one hand on the calf and the other wrapped around the flashlight, angling its beam upward like a beacon. When distant shapes finally emerged through the swirling dust, Mason's shout, Carla's silhouette, Evelyn didn't move until she felt the calf try to rise beside her. Only then did she let herself believe they might both make it through this night. Sunrise crept over the basin like a soft apology, gilding the wreckage the storm had left behind. Evelyn stood near the pen, hair tangled with dried dust, jacket torn at the cuff from the night before. Mason and Carla worked in silence, assessing bent panels, scattered debris, and sand drifts piled like sleeping giants against the fence lines. The calf rested inside the reinforced holding pen, wrapped in blankets Mason had warmed in the generator shed. Her breathing was steadier now, slower, but exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. She lifted her head whenever Evelyn stepped close, trunk stretching as if trying to make sure the voice from last night had followed her into the morning. Mason cleared his throat as he packed away medical supplies. "Her vitals are holding. She's lucky you found her when you did." He paused, looking at Evelyn with something between respect and worry. "But headquarters reviewed the storm report. They want us to accelerate relocation. They're worried she's becoming dependent." His tone made the word feel heavier than it should. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She rested her hand against the cool metal bars, watching the calf shift under the blankets. The idea of sending her away now, after the terror of the storm, after the fragile thread that had tied them together, felt like tearing open a wound that hadn't even begun to split until this moment. "She's not ready," Evelyn finally whispered. Carla approached, tablet in hand. "Orders aren't flexible. They'll send a transport team tonight if the roads hold." She hesitated, tapping at the cracked screen. "I know this isn't easy. Believe me, I don't want to see her hauled off either. But we can't let her imprint on humans. If she ever joins a herd, she needs instinct more than comfort." Evelyn's jaw tightened. Comfort. The word hit harder than Carla meant it to. Comfort was what Jake had begged for through radio static during his final hours. Comfort was what she couldn't give him. And now, with a creature who reached for her voice in a storm, she was being asked to step aside. Even if it meant survival, something in her grieved the idea. Leo arrived late that morning, pedaling hard, cheeks flushed from cold air. He brought sketches he'd made of the calf, rough pencil drawings of her standing, lying down, reaching toward the bars. "I thought maybe she'd want these," he said shyly, though he knew elephants didn't keep mementos. Evelyn smiled anyway. "She'll feel you care," she murmured. But by midday, the refuge was a hive of unwelcome preparation. Extra straps arrived, thick transport blankets, sedation vials Mason hoped he wouldn't need. The calf sensed the tension. She paced the pen, trunk curling nervously, eyes fixed on Evelyn as if she were the only familiar landmark in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. As evening slipped in, orange and weary, Evelyn walked to the pen once more. She hummed softly, the same lullaby that had carried them both through the storm. The calf settled near the bars, pressing her forehead lightly against them. Evelyn leaned close, letting her voice drift into the cooling air. She wished the night could hold them here a little longer. But when dawn returned, cold, pale, indifferent, the refuge greeted her with a silence that hit like a blow. The pen gate hung open, sand drifted in soft piles across the floor, and the blankets Mason had left inside were scattered like shed skins. The calf was gone. No calls, no broken panels this time. Just emptiness. Mason sprinted from the equipment shed, disbelief etched into every line of his face. She couldn't have slipped through the fencing, not with that reinforcement. Carla checked the cameras, but most had drowned in dust and static during the storm. "Nothing recorded after 2 a.m., she muttered, voice tight. "No transport crew. No alerts." Evelyn stepped inside the pen, knees weakening as she traced the faint prints leading toward the outer boundary. The tracks were small, hurried, but not panicked. Almost purposeful. They followed them past the wash, up a low ridge, until the trail thinned into the endless sweep of desert dunes. A vast, quiet space where the wind erased answers faster than anyone could ask the questions. Her throat ached as she looked out across the white expanse. She was terrified last night, Evelyn whispered. Why would she leave now? Mason rested a hand on his hip, scanning the endless horizon. Unless something called to her. The idea felt impossible, yet the desert held its silence like it knew more than any of them. Evelyn wrapped Jake's jacket tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't crying, not yet, but the familiar ache had returned. Sharp, hollow, and frighteningly close to the grief she'd thought she couldn't feel again. The calf wasn't dead. But absence, she remembered, could hurt just as deeply. And for the second time in one lifetime, she stood in a place where someone she cared for had vanished without a goodbye. For 2 days, the refuge moved like a search party caught inside a clock. Every hour counted, yet none produced answers. Mason and Carla hiked the dunes at sunrise, scanning for tracks that dissolved beneath shifting winds. Evelyn waited near the boundary fence, watching the horizon until her eyes ached, refusing to believe the calf had simply vanished into the empty miles. Leo brought his drone every afternoon, launching it into shaky air, hoping its small camera might catch a glimpse of gray against white. Each flight returned nothing but sand ripples and the long shadows of mesquite bushes. Still, he tried again each day, like the attempt itself meant something. Evelyn thanked him with a hand on his shoulder, though her voice held little strength. By the third evening, a strange quiet settled over the basin. Not the heavy stillness of grief, but something tighter. More like anticipation winding itself into the bones of the land. Evelyn felt it prick the back of her neck as she stepped outside, clutching Jake's jacket the way she used to clutch a medical file before delivering bad news. She sensed movement before she saw it. A dark line touched the horizon first, barely visible in the amber light. Then shapes began to emerge. Broad, deliberate, moving with the grounded certainty of creatures who belonged to the earth. Mason rushed out beside her, binoculars already lifted. "No way," he breathed. "Those are elephants. Actual elephants. Not just the calf." As the herd drew closer, the ground vibrated beneath their feet, a deep resonance Evelyn felt more than heard. 7 of them moved in a loose formation. 3 large females, 2 juveniles, and a towering matriarch leading the way. And there, tucked between them with a steadier gait than she had ever shown before, was the orphaned calf, no longer trembling, no longer alone. Carla stepped forward, stunned. This region hasn't recorded a herd in years. They never cross this far south. Her voice faltered as the matriarch slowed near the fence line, trunk lifting to test the air. The others followed her lead, forming a crescent of silent power and watchfulness. It felt less like an arrival and more like a gathering with purpose. The calf eased out from the protection of the matriarch's shadow, pausing just beyond the final stretch of sand. Her eyes found Evelyn instantly, recognition blooming like a quiet spark. She took a few small steps forward, each one deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if she were being carried by something larger than instinct alone. Evelyn's breath caught as the calf approached the fence, stopping only a yard away. The young elephant lifted her trunk, not in fear, but in offering. Something glinted against the dusty sky, wrapped in the tender curl of her grasp. When she lowered it gently onto the ground, the object hit the sand with a soft, weighted thud that echoed in Evelyn's chest. Mason crouched first, brushing aside the grit. His hand froze. Then he looked up at Evelyn, eyes wide with disbelief. "It's a necklace," he whispered. "A silver one." Evelyn knelt beside him, fingers trembling as she lifted the familiar shape. The chain was bent, dirt-caked, one side scorched, but unmistakable. Jake's necklace, the one he'd worn on every deployment, the one search teams never recovered from the fire zone. Her breath wavered, a sound fragile enough to crack. Memories flashed like a reel, Jake laughing as he clasped it around his neck, Jake stepping into the smoke with fearless certainty, Jake lost somewhere in the blaze that never gave anything back. Yet here it was, returned by a creature who had crawled through the same hell of ash and burned earth. The calf rumbled softly, a low, trembling note that vibrated through Evelyn's palms as she clutched the necklace to her chest. It wasn't sorrow she felt. Not fully. It was something deeper, a recognition that grief could move in circles, finding unexpected ways to return pieces of what had been taken. The calf stepped back, as if satisfied she had delivered what needed delivering. The matriarch called to her with a deep, resonant trumpet, and the calf turned, rejoining the safety of the herd. Evelyn rose slowly, tears streaking through the dust on her cheeks, but there was steadiness in her posture now, a clarity she hadn't felt since the day the officers knocked on her door. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she meant it for the calf, her son, or the desert itself. The herd began to move away, their silhouettes melding with the sinking sun. The calf looked back once, just once, her small frame haloed in gold, the wind lifting, the dust around her like she carried her own kind of light. Then she followed the others, step for steady step, leaving no footprints the wind didn't claim. When the last echo of their movement dissolved into silence, Evelyn remained by the fence, necklace clenched in her hand. But the emptiness that used to live in her chest no longer felt like a void. It felt like a door finally closing. Not in loss, but in peace. And for the first time in months, she inhaled deeply without the air catching on sorrow. If this story touched you, even just a little, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Nothing complicated, just a small sign that you're still here, listening, and walking with us through these moments. And if you'd like to travel with me through the next chapter, through more true stories of courage, loss, healing, and the bonds that surprise us in the quiet places of life, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your presence here truly matters. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.